Good afternoon. Welcome to the March 21st, 2024 meeting of the Business Operations Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. Aiden, please take a roll call of the commissioners.
Commissioner Eddie Smith. Here. Commissioner Woodson. Here. Chair Carter.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Are there any questions or comments from the commissioners before we begin? There being none. In the review of our agenda, the Business Operation Committee will hear several updates from the staff on the agenda today and vote on 3 contract approvals. First, we will hear the Executive Director's operational update from Tess Stovall, including 3 contracts for vote. Then the Commissioner Director of Finance and Operation, Melanie Harwell, will present budget updates, including the fiscal year 24 budget to actuals update, fiscal year 25 budget update, and a grant update or grants update. Do we have any questions or comments on the agenda before we vote for approval?
Motion to approve agenda.
There is a motion to approve the agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been properly second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the agenda is approved. Now we need to look at approving the minutes from the January 25th, 2024 meeting.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the minutes are approved. Again, the first item on our agenda is an operational update from our Executive Director, Tess Stovall. Tess, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Carter. Your Executive Director update for today is relatively brief. So we've had no staffing changes since our last quarterly meeting. We have begun procurement work for FY25, and since the procurement procedures for the commission require a committee approval for any procurement or contract over $25,000. We do want to go ahead and bring those forth to you today for consideration as we move through the procurement process in the next couple months. So the first is to continue the interagency agreement with the Tennessee Language Center. So the Tennessee Language Center provides translation services and interpretation services, which we need as an LEA, both for translation of our procedures and policies, as well as if we have any parents or community members that reach out to us that we have availability for interpretation needs. The second contract is for PowerSchool. PowerSchool is our student information system that we use to manage and report data to the Department of Education. All of our schools use PowerSchool as their student information system. We are under a statewide contract that is with the Department of Education and PowerSchool. So we are just a part of that contract, but as we grow our student enrollment, the overall dollar amount for that contract or that invoice that we pay increases. We don't have an exact amount yet because we haven't finalized what the FY25 costs will be, but we do anticipate that being over $25,000, so we wanted to go ahead and get that approved by the committee. And then finally, we have an extension of a contract with Kelly Croneman. Kelly was a former staff member of the commission and has moved into a consultant role. So that would just be to extend her contract for FY25. And then lastly, wanted to give this committee a heads up that one of the responsibilities of the committee is to set the next calendar year's commission meetings. And so in July, I will be bringing to the committee for approval and recommendation to the commission commission meeting dates for 2025. What will happen is that all commissioners will receive a survey from staff between now and July, where we will survey possible dates to determine if we have a quorum before we present those dates to this committee for approval. Most of the dates that we meet on are driven by statutory deadlines. So for example, we always make sure that we're going to meet sometime in mid-October to hear our new start appeal process. Similarly, with our ASD applications typically happening in January, as well as renewal appeals that we might receive, we are going to be looking at our statutory deadlines before offering potential dates for the commission to approve. And with that, that concludes my updates, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Any of the commissioners have questions for Tess? So we have a motion for approval of the contracts with the Tennessee Language Center, Power School, and Kelly Croman.
So moved.
It's been moved. Is there a second? Second. It's been properly second. All those approvals, say aye. Aye. Ayes have it. Those against, say no. Well, excuse me. I think you know what I'm talking about. Okay. So the ayes have it, and the contracts are approved. Are there any other questions or comments for Tess before we move on? There being none, Tess, thank you for keeping us updated.
Thank you.
The final item on our agenda today are updates on the fiscal year 24 budget to actuals, the fiscal year 25 budget, and grants from the Director of Finance and Operations, Melanie Harwell. Melanie, you are recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair Carter. Excited to be providing an FY24 budget to actuals update, as well as our thinking for FY25, before we'll talk in a little bit greater detail about some of our grants for this year and our thinking for next year. So the first is that we've provided the updated FY24 budget to actuals. These are through February 15th, so they're pretty up to date. I think one thing I want to flag is that with the last TISA true-up data that occurred in February, there was a slight decrease to both Memphis Shelby County's per pupil rate and the Davidson County per pupil rate. That wasn't because of a change in the revenue assumptions. That was because as districts were getting students coded, there was an increase in the ADM in total across both districts. So this wasn't hugely impactful to our revenue assumptions, but there have been some changes there that we want to make sure that we can incorporate. While also not reflected on the spreadsheet, I will be talking about the approximately $9.7 million that we received in grant funding, and about some of the updates that we're making for next year's consolidated funding application and our contingency plan, since we do not still have final Title I or title program and IDA allocations for this school year. For FY25, not asking for a vote on any budget amendments today, because we'll be waiting to see what comes out of the General Assembly's final budget after approved. But we have updated it to incorporate what we know or think about our enrollment for next year, as well as the potential new position that was included in the governor's approved budget. So we were very excited that our position request was included in that recommended budget. We've also made sure that we have kept our TISA estimates relatively stagnant, but there has been a request to the General Assembly for about $200 extra per pupil as part of the TISA base rate for next year. We're trying to keep these assumptions still conservative because we're continuing to see declining tax revenues across the state, both in local sales tax and with some state revenue. So we're monitoring these conversations really closely to make sure that we maintain a comfortable position with our revenue assumptions. Again, our funding request to Finance and Administration for one additional position for to support EL learners was included, and we'll wait to see when the budget's finalized if we get funding for that position or not. So we'll be bringing an amended FY25 budget into July after the close of legislative session. So I'm happy to take any questions about either the FY24 budget actuals or FY25 budget before diving in on some grants.
So just a couple of questions on the current budget that we're in. I see that overall we're kind of a little bit behind. Is that mostly due to the TISA true up? And are you expecting that to kind of be where we end up for this fiscal year?
Yes, I don't think that we're going to end up substantially different one way or the other from where we're currently sitting. We have to pay out our FY23 authorizer fee refund and our the final revenue true up as well. So there's a piece of that sort of accounting that is in process for that will change sort of our final numbers. But again, that won't have a material impact on things like our reversion. We are coming in under budget pretty much across all categories. And I think, even though we try to keep our forecast conservative, that we will continue to be under budget as we move toward the end of the year.
And then just as a positive, looking at the 25, I mean, really, it looks like our reversion of what's projected is about $23,000 greater than what the state gives us. So we're sitting right on that cusp of what the General Assembly wanted, which is us being self-sufficient. So just great work to you and your staff and Tess and the rest of the team for everything you all are doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we're excited, and we did share that update about our projections with the General Assembly as part of our budget hearings. So I think we're keeping in mind, we do know, obviously, as we continue through the pre-opening process, we may see some fluctuations in enrollment assumptions. But yeah, we're very encouraged, and I feel pretty comfortable saying we should be on track to be at sustainability, hopefully in FY26, pretty comfortably.
Any other questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Woodson?
Okay, great. Well, I want to give a quick update on some of our grants for this year and some changes that we will be implementing for next year. So the first is just big picture. We currently have about $9.7 million in grant funding that's passed through to our school. That includes the traditional entitlement grants. You typically hear these referred to as the CFA or the Consolidated Funding Application. That includes, again, all the title grants, IDA Part B, and pre-K. The application for that for FY25 just opened, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in just a moment. We also receive some school improvement grants that are passed through primarily to our schools that have transitioned out of the ASD. So these are not for all of our schools. These have very specific requirements, and those are the Turnaround Action Grant, and then we've seen some additional funding this year in what's called the State SIG, or the State School Improvement Grant as well. We have some discretionary grants that some or multiple of our schools may access depending on their programmatic needs. And then we also have relief funding, ESSER 2.0 and 3.0 this year, as well as TNL Core. But this is the fiscal year that we'll be wrapping up that fiscal work stream. And so those will be closing out at the end of this federal fiscal year. So as I mentioned, we're still waiting on final FY24 consolidated funding allocations. So we have implemented a contingency plan with that and have had a lot of ongoing conversations with the department to make sure that, one, we are getting schools to a place where they can draw down at least some of their initial allocations. We've allocated out already about 50%. I think we'll be moving to let them draw down more than that as we get closer to the end of the school year. But I do think the most immediate implication of this at this point is that we will likely have more carryover into FY25 for these grants, particularly for IDA. So because of the way IDA is funded around enrollment growth and the requirements to meet supplement, not supplant requirements, depending on how large our final allocation is, we may have more carryover than traditionally we would, but we'll make sure that all of our schools can access that in the same way next year that they would have been able to this year. But that's something that we're monitoring and trying to keep our schools updated on as well. Finally, when we talk about the consolidated funding application, a big piece of that is Title I, and I want to talk a little bit about our Title I methodology. So currently, all of our schools are Title I eligible in the district. As we've grown, I think we expect that next year we will have non-Title I schools for the first time in our portfolio. So what that means is that there are some different requirements around district allocation procedures, around the determinations for school-wide eligibility for Title I funding that will just slightly change how we have to structure those funding allocations. So the first is that Title I school-wide eligibility is based on poverty rate. And so when we think about the poverty rate for Title I, that typically has been limited to direct certified students, which are from the SNAP-TANF list. So this year, there's been a lot of conversation. I think we've had some conversation in this committee about Medicaid certification data, which is available for the first time sort of statewide this year because the state is participating in a pilot program. So We have been working with our schools and with the TDOE to make sure that we're starting to get access to that certification data. And we have worked with the department to make sure that we are able to use that data to drive specifically Title I school designations and school eligibility metrics. So I think there's been a lot of conversation about this statewide, and there can be some confusion around this is still not a metric that will be used for TISA funding. This is still not a metric that will be used for other funding streams, but we are going to opt in to including those counts for school-wide designations next year. So we're working closely with our schools to make sure that we are getting that data, that it's coded in the SIS, and that we're making sure that we feel good about using the poverty metrics available to us to accurately reflect their student body. So that's an update that we'll be making for next year, in addition to just having to include some Title II, III, and IV pass-through funding streams. So with that, any schools that ultimately end up ineligible for Title I funding are not able to consolidate into what's been called our school-wide pool. So this is where you can consolidate across funding streams and are able to use funds for any eligible purpose. So if a school is not Title I eligible, they will not receive a separate Title I funding, but they will still continue to receive Title IIs, III, and IV allocations as applicable to their schools. This just means we'll have to manage those as separate pots of money for those schools rather than consolidating it into a larger fund. Before we move on to TISA, are there any questions about grants, Title I updates for next year?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not a committee member.
Madam Chair?
Has there been a change in the percentage of economically disadvantaged students that have to be enrolled in a school in order for it to be school-wide Title I eligible that's driving some of this?
That is a great question. There is not a change. There is a nuance there. So to be Title I school-wide eligible, a school has to have a poverty rate of 40%, or we have to request and receive a waiver to include them. If a school falls below 35%, you can still request a waiver, but it kicks in a very complicated additional step to your funding formula that requires you to weight the per pupil amounts for each school differently. So in the past, I think if we've had in one instance a school that fell at 39.8%, we were able to request a waiver. However, mathematically, the rules that begin to apply if a school falls below 35% are actually not impossible for us to incorporate as a district because of the way you have to start to weight allocations and how it would be split up demographically across the district. We actually can't do it. We can't make the math work to where we could pick up more schools that way. And especially, it is not something that we could make work next year. It's also something that would require us to recalculate all of that every single year and would not be a sustainable standard as we move forward, even if we were to hypothetically be able to make it work an additional year. So that being said, no, there has not been a change to that piece of the formula, but this is the first time we've ever had to deal with that particular nuance.
Madam Chair, any other questions? I'd like to recognize Commissioner Smith.
Thank you. It's working. Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I thought you were talking about me. Sorry.
Forgive me.
No, you're fine. Thank you.
I'd like to recognize Commissioner Lauren Smith first.
Thank you. You mentioned we have a school or multiple schools who won't be Title I status. Can you elaborate on that? How many schools, which schools? I'm just curious the percentage.
Yeah, currently, Rutherford Collegiate Prep is not projected to be Title I based on their economically disadvantaged rates. And even new schools are funded based on projections. Those designations are based on projections, but based on those projections, we're not anticipating that they will be Title I eligible. Tennessee Nature Academy is also a school that currently does not meet the Title I threshold strictly based on the traditional direct cert data. We're waiting to see once all of the Medicaid data is coded, if that would potentially put them over the 35% threshold to where we could request a waiver. I think that is possible, but pretty unlikely. Yeah.
Commissioner Eddie Smith.
And on the grants, are we leveraging any of the IDCR within those grants for some of the commission work where we're having to manage that?
No, we do not currently take any consolidated administrative costs off of those grants. So we're not charging admin fees off of that, or indirect costs is another thing that people talk about a lot. We pass through 100% of our grant funding to our schools.
Are there any other questions from other commissioners?
Okay, great, thank you. Well, just quickly, I'll also provide a quick TISA update since it's still a hot topic around the state. So we did receive our FY23 final revenue true-up. This was about $1.3 million due from MNPS and $220,000 due from MSCS. As a reminder, we don't assess any authorizer fee on those funds, so we work with both districts to get checks from them and send that money out to our schools. We're very excited. Metro's already sent us their check, so we will be able to get those out to schools hopefully next week. And we're still waiting to hear back from MSCS about when we can expect that check and how to move forward there. Finally, I mentioned in our budget updates, the February ADM true-up. Both MSCS and Davidson County per pupil amounts changed and decreased based on rising ADMs in both districts. I think importantly, some of the conversation around this is specifically focused on the fact that there has been a pretty substantial decrease to Metro Nashville's per pupil rate from sort of the highest estimates that were initially coming out from TISA. So this has been something that I know some of our schools have had to deal with, that we've kept an eye on. So this isn't there hasn't been a $600 change in this year, but when initial TISA estimates were released, there has been a pretty substantial decrease from that. So we've been talking with our schools. I know there's been a lot of attention being paid by our Davidson County schools to these estimates, and it's something that we've continued to monitor as the year has gone on. And then I did mention there are some indications of declining state and local tax revenue. We know both state collections and local sales tax revenue is coming in under projections in some case. So we're also continuing conversations with our district partners to make sure that we're all aligned on if it's looking like we could be facing a decrease for next year, or certainly I'm sure they'd be happy to get a true up from us at some point, that we are all on the same page about that, and that we know that that's coming and have more notice instead of less. And then as we think about TISA for FY25, we're beginning to receive monthly data files from the department, as well as some initial TISA estimates. These are pretty encouraging overall. The data holistically is looking pretty good. We're pretty happy with where our schools are at with their data. There has been one change to the way that the English learner unique learning need weights are funded. Last year, it was just based essentially on an enrollment count of ELs in each tier of funding. This year, that's being moved to completed IEPs that are fully compliant with all requirements. So that's individualized learning plans. Katie and Nate have done an incredible job working with our schools to make sure that even as there were some challenges with rolling out the new ILP system, T and Pulse this year, that really, in the context of where the state sends on this data, our schools are doing quite well. And I know both my team and their team are working both on the finance side and with special POP staff to make sure that they're very aware of these changes, and that they understand where there are gaps, what they need to do to come into compliance to, one, make sure that they're compliant, but two, also receive funding for those students. And then, as I mentioned, there is also a proposed increase to the base amount that was included in the governor's proposed budget. That's about a $200 per pupil difference to where it would be slightly over $7,000 as the base state TISA funding moving forward. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions from commissioners? For Melanie.
Save it for
Melanie, well,
July.
thank you for keeping us updated regarding our commission's finances. Thank you all for your attendance and participation at this meeting of the Business Operations Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. At this time, I would like to ask if there are any final comments.